All right, guys, I'm going to dive right in. There's so much I want to share with you, so little time. So first I want to start with presenting you a highly scientific argument for the existence of God. It's going to be really influential in the years ahead. And here's that argument. If there is no God, how come the world fits so perfectly into a chicken? Okay, that's the big question for today. Okay, now I'm only kidding. Don't worry. I got better arguments on the way. But I'll be honest with you guys. When I got to college, I thought that was about as rational as faith could be. I thought faith was for people who didn't think hard enough. I thought faith had to be blind. I thought faith was just for people who weren't that smart. But I was challenged by two soccer teammates to start reading the Bible, and I began to read through this text. I found myself falling in love with the person of Jesus. I didn't expect that. And then I kept reading through this text, and I got to the book of Acts in the New Testament, and I started to come across all sorts of words I never expected to see. Words like examined and reasoned and explained and debated and convinced and even proved. Never expected to see those words in the Bible. And I kept reading, and I read, it says at one point that this one people group, they were more noble than this other people group. Why? Not because they had blind faith, but it says because they examined the scriptures daily to determine if what they were being told was true. Not blind faith. And I kept reading, and then I got a little further into this book. First time I had ever read it. I got to 1 Corinthians 15. There's a paragraph in that chapter. It's an incredibly early creed, scholars have told us. It's from almost immediately after Jesus had died. And in that passage, it confidently claims that hundreds of people were walking around utterly convinced after his death that they had spent time with Jesus. And it even says, most of whom are still living. As if to say, if you don't believe me, fine. Go out and ask them for yourself. And I'm reading this for the first time, and I'm thinking, how am I supposed to explain that? The death of Jesus should have been the end of the movement, and instead, somehow, it was the start of the greatest movement of all time. I was at Princeton University at the time. I was studying philosophy. I arranged meetings with the two top New Testament professors at the university. Neither of them were Christians. They didn't believe in God. And I went to them, and I opened up to that passage, and I said, how do you explain this? If you don't believe in God, how do you explain that this man who clearly was killed, now, almost immediately thereafter, there's hundreds of people walking around utterly convinced that they had spent time with him after his death? I understand that Christians say that makes sense because of the resurrection, but if not the resurrection, how do you explain that? And one of those professors glanced in the direction of a mass hallucination theory. Maybe we'll talk more about it later, but it's a theory that has earned no credibility in the scholarly literature. It's riddled with problems. The other professor of mine told me that as a historian, he simply wasn't interested in the question. He seemed to think that because we were talking about the miraculous, we were no longer talking about something serious. We were no longer talking about history. And I've never been able to understand why he thought that he could just make that assumption rather than dealing with the evidence and following it wherever it led. Long story short, I came to the conclusion that the Christian faith was not asking me for blind faith, far from it. This was a God who wasn't just asking me to love him with all of my heart, all of my soul, all of my strength. He was asking me to love him with all of my mind. And I remember reasoning to myself, if God made me, and if he made me with this mind, then he would want an honest intellectual search to at least point in his direction. And ultimately, that's just what I found. And 6 months later, after I had investigated all of the evidence, I came to the point where I was utterly confident that Jesus was who he claimed to be. I dropped down to my knees in my dorm room. It was 122 Jolene Hall was the name of my dorm room. There was nobody there. I was by myself, but I exclaimed out loud. I said, oh my gosh, this really happened. And I gave my life to Jesus right then and there. I became a Christian. And the incredible thing is that I could become a Christian and be utterly confident in my eternal future right there and then in that moment. Because the Christian God, Jesus, was not asking me to do a whole bunch of stuff to try to get good enough to be with him. He was simply asking me to accept that he had already done everything necessary to come down to me. And all he was asking was for me to accept that incredible gift. How amazing is that? That there's never anything between us and accepting that incredible gift and having utter security and confidence in where you're headed. Maybe for some of you today will be that day where you've asked your questions. No question is off limits. You've received some good answers. It's made sense up here. You feel God pulling at your heart down here, and you say, today's going to be the day where I drop to my knees and have that confidence of who I am, of who made me, of who loves me, and of where I'm headed. My story started with a couple of soccer teammates. Okay, they challenged me to read this book, and I've always been a lover of sports. But here's a sporting experience I wouldn't want to ever experience. Imagine you walk into this gym. You see people moving around. You see people playing some sort of game. And as you watch them, you don't know when the game started. You don't know when the game's going to finish. You don't know what the objective of the game is, and you don't know any of the rules. But you're supposed to be playing in the game. So what would you do? Well, you'd go to the other players, and you'd ask those 4 questions. When did the game start? When did it finish? What's the point of the game? What are the rules? What if they all gave you different answers? Okay, then what if you found a coach on the sideline? You said, Coach, give me the answer to these questions. And he said, no, don't worry about it. Just keep playing. You're doing great. We got a first place trophy waiting for you. And then you try to find a referee for the game. But then you find out actually the players didn't like the referee's calls. They sent him home. It is our knowledge of the start, the finish, the objective, and the rules of a game that allow us to engage in the game in a meaningful way. If you don't have answers to those 4 questions, all you can do on the court is just pretend and hope no one realizes that you actually have no idea what you're doing. And the reason I give you that example is because it's not just a game. Actually, that is the situation that so many people are walking around doing life with. We don't have answers to the most fundamental questions of life. The same exact 4 questions. Where did we come from? How did it all begin? Where are we headed? Destiny? What's the purpose of life? Meaning? And then how should we live? Morality. And the thing that I find interesting is that when I give you the example of the game, of the sporting example, it's immediately obvious to everyone. Of course, you couldn't engage in that game meaningfully without answers to those 4 questions. Well, then what I want to say is, why do we think that we can engage in life meaningfully without answers to those same exact 4 questions? Now, some questions don't need answers. I was doing a search of the top 1,000 questions on Google recently. Very enlightening. And you start working your way through that. Quite close to the top, within the first few dozen, why is my poop green? Like, you don't need an answer to that question. Like, just don't ask. Like, it's not worth knowing. Then you work a little bit further down. Why are cats scared of cucumber? Is that a thing? That's actually a thing? Like, what are you doing with your cucumbers? Like, why is your cat scared of your cucumber? We don't need answers to every question, but I think we do need answers to these questions. Origin, where have we come from? Destiny, where are we headed? Meaning, what's the purpose of life? Why am I here? And how should we live? And apologetics, that whole Christian practice of asking questions about God and to God, what we're going to be doing today, it's not just about finding answers to your questions, it's also about figuring out which questions need answers. And I put to you today that these are 4 critical questions. Our founder of our ministry, Ravi Zacharias, he's identified these 4 questions. He says if you're going to live a meaningful life, you need answers to these 4 questions. Let me say something very briefly about each one. Let me start with origin. Where did all of this come from? You just look around. This gym, the earth, the universe. Where did it all come from? And my assumption used to be Christianity offers the crazy answer to that question. Science offers the reasonable, sober, sensible answer. I've changed my mind about that because I was emailing back and forth with a friend of mine. He was listing out all of his objections to Christianity, and then at the end of the email, he said to me, "Nor can I believe in a virgin birth." No further argument. As if to say it would be crazy to believe in such a thing. And I started writing an email back to him, trying to persuade him maybe he could believe in a virgin birth. And then it dawned on me. Then I realized, you know what? He already does. Follow me here. Maybe Christians aren't the only people who believe in something as miraculous, extraordinary as a virgin birth. Maybe everyone believes in a virgin birth, whether they realize it or not. Take the brilliant Cambridge physicist, Stephen Hawking. Here's how he attempts to propose an atheistic birth of our universe. He says the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. That looks a lot like a virgin birth to me. Or now consider the explanation given by the atheist philosopher Quentin Smith. Okay, this is a guy with 150 academic articles, 12 books to his name. Here's what he says from his atheistic perspective. He says, "The fact of the matter is that the most reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. We should acknowledge our foundation in nothingness and feel awe at the marvelous fact that we have a chance to participate briefly in this incredible sunburst," catch this, "that interrupts without reason the reign of non-being." And again, I looked at the atheistic response and I thought, that sounds a lot like a virgin birth. Maybe it's not a matter of whether we believe in a virgin birth. Maybe it's just a matter of which virgin birth we choose to accept. And you can believe in an atheistic virgin birth of our entire universe, one where we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. Wow, that doesn't give me a lot of hope. And one that interrupts without reason the reign of non-being. Or you can believe in a God who, in his word, is asking you to reason, who's asking you to love him with your mind, who's asking you to dig deep into the reasons for his existence, and a God who's not indifferent to you, like an atheistic universe, but a God who calls you family, who calls you friend, who calls you son, who calls you daughter. That's actually the exact opposite of indifference. There's a God who knows everything about you and yet could not love you more fully. I think that's an incredible gift. A brief thought about origin. What about morality? How should we live? Now, most people will grant me that morality has to be based on the equal value of every single person. Okay, we're happy to agree to that. But now that raises a question. If every person is equally valuable, there has to be something which is equally true of every single person, in virtue of which they are equally valuable. So what's that thing? What's that thing that is exactly the same, equally true of every single one of us, and therefore gives each one of us equal value? It's actually a tough question. And if you take God out of the picture, it's very hard to come up with a good answer. Because so much about us is very different. Some of us are taller than others. Some of us are stronger than others. Some of us are smarter than others. Some of us are more likely eventually to pass on our genes than others. Everything from a natural perspective is different about us. What's the one thing that's equally true of every single person in this room and could never shift, could never change, is absolutely eternal? I think there's only one answer to that question: the love of God. The fact that you were created in the image of God. And not just any God. Some people believe in gods who will love you if you are good enough or if you believe in them. But no, I'm talking about the extravagant, unconditional, no-ifs love of the Christian God that is for every single person and that cannot be earned and cannot be lost. Okay, the love of a father. Jesus tells this story in the Bible, the love of a father who sees a son far off on the horizon. It says, while the son was still far away. And this is a son who had gotten everything wrong. You think that you've messed up. You think you've gotten things wrong. This son got everything wrong. He demanded his inheritance early. He ran off. He wasted all of the family's money on exactly the things you're not supposed to waste money on. And now finally he gets to the point where he's eating with the pigs at a farm. And he says, I've got to go back home. And he starts to come back home. And this father sees his son, who did everything wrong, still far off on the horizon, and the Bible says that he takes off running towards his son. And I've always imagined, what did it look like from the son's perspective? The son probably thought he was more likely to get yelled at and hit than what actually happened. And this father runs to his son and throws himself on his son and kisses him and embraces him, gives him, the text says, his best robe, gives him a ring on his finger, puts sandals on his feet, calls back to the rest of the family and says, kill the best animal we have. We're throwing the biggest party you've ever seen. The son of mine was lost, but now is found. You don't find that type of love in any other religion or anywhere else in the world. A love where you could get everything wrong, where you've done nothing right, and when your heavenly Father sees you far off still on the horizon, he takes off running like an embarrassing fool just to reach you, just to come to you, just to embrace you, just to kiss you, and just to welcome you home. It's a love that's not supposed to be earned. It's a love that's just supposed to be returned. That's, I believe, the only thing about every single person in this room, which is exactly the same, the love of God for each one of you. And that's why only that truth, which is common to all, can ground the common morality of all, which is based in the equal value of every single person. Origin, morality. Say something very quickly about meaning. Actually, I'll leave meaning for later so we don't get too far behind before we even get the day started. If you want to hear reflections on meaning, just ask during one of the times of Q&A. We're so excited to receive your questions. Let me say something very quickly about destiny. Where are we headed? Are we headed anywhere? I saw a commercial a while back. It's kind of an odd commercial, but it depicted a baby being born, okay, in the hospital. And then over the next 30 seconds, this baby flew through the air. And as the baby's flying across the sky, you see the child go through every different aspect of life. So the baby becomes an infant, and then a toddler, and then an adolescent, and then a teenager, and gets older and older, and now is kind of 50s, 60s, 70s, becomes hunched over, the hair is gray, the teeth are starting to fall out, and then crashes at the end of the commercial into a grave, dead. And then the screen went black, and words appeared across the screen. And this is what it read. We can skip through to the black PowerPoint slide. Life is short. Play more Xbox. And I sort of responded like you guys did. You know, I laughed. I thought that's really funny. But then I also thought to myself, you know what? That's also devastating. Is that really the best that we've got? When a loved one dies? When a child dies? When the person who you trusted most betrays you? When you feel so alone and lonely that it hurts? Play more Xbox? Is that the best we've got? You know? We live in a world that's broken and unjust, and it's all headed towards death and injustice, but there's nothing we can do about it, so just distract yourself with more Facebook and more Xbox and spend more time in Vegas. Life is short, play more Xbox. Is that really the best that we've got? One of the things we want to say to you today is that Jesus Christ offers such a better hope. I want you to read this quote with me from a dear friend. It says, if the resurrection is true, then what that means for you is that it comes to a point in your life where it seems like there is no hope. If it comes to a point in your life where it seems like even death is inevitable and there's no way to escape it, well, death is not the end. There's more. There's hope no matter what. Those are the words of a dear colleague and friend of ours, Nabil Qureshi. He wrote an amazing book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, from a Muslim background, became a Christian. We lost him 2 years ago, almost to the day. Last week was his 2-year anniversary of his death. We lost him to cancer at the age of 34. But he remained confident in those words to his very last breath, because he knew that death could not hold Jesus. And if it could not hold Jesus, then it could not hold him either. He knew he would go on to live. He knew that Jesus had promised that there would be a day where there would be no more mourning or death or crying or pain. He knew that Jesus had promised that he had gone to prepare a place for him in his Father's house, in a house that we will live in together. And even as I was first putting together the material for this talk, I used to live in the same apartment building as Nabil, 2 floors down, directly below him and his wife and child. And I found myself smiling and reflecting on the thought that maybe one day soon we will again live in the same building. Maybe one day soon Nabil will again be just 2 floors below. That is how concrete and how real and how tangible the hope of Jesus is. If we're willing to let him speak to our minds, and we're willing to experience him in our hearts, and we're willing to respond by putting our trust in him. Not every question needs an answer, but if you want to not just pretend in life, okay, if you want to live life in a way which is meaningful and have confidence in where you're headed, then some questions do need answers. And I think those questions are the questions of origin, of destiny, of meaning, of morality. Where did we come from? Where are we headed? What's the purpose of life? And how should we live? You could search everywhere else for answers to those questions, but I think you'll only find compelling answers in the person of Jesus, and those are some of the answers that we want to share with you today. Thank you guys so much for listening to me.